But Dad, we only had $3 left yesterday. How did that man just hand you the keys to a house that big? 6-year-old Leo whispered, his voice trembling as he stared past the scratched minivan windshield at the towering wrought-iron gates. Ethan Miller's hand, still clutching the heavy brass keychain, felt numb. Just 24 hours ago, he was splitting a cold sandwich with a stranger on a park bench, convinced they were both at the absolute bottom. Now he was standing on cracked asphalt, looking at a structure that screamed old money, a mansion in the hills of Brentwood, California, that absolutely could not belong to him. The impossibility of the sudden transfer was a physical weight pressing on his chest. Someone, somewhere, had made a terrible mistake, or worse, this was a sophisticated, dangerous setup. The millionaire, Mr. Hawthorne, had simply smiled and driven away, leaving Ethan alone with an undeniable, terrifying wealth. Elias Hawthorne moved through his enormous, silent office suite on the 45th floor of the Bancorp Tower like a ghost. At 63, he was the architect of Hawthorne Global, a private equity monolith that devoured and resurrected failing enterprises, turning debt into glittering assets. His routine was legendary. 5 A0 AM spin class, 6 30 AM market analysis, 8 E0 AM first meeting. Today, the 8 E0 AM meeting was a formality, confirming the immediate transfer of the Brentwood property, the old summer house, into a man named Ethan Miller. Elias barely listened to his chief legal officer, Mr. Chen, who rattled off the document's final signatures. His authority was absolute, his word law. When Elias leaned forward, Chen stopped mid-sentence, expecting a correction or a severe interrogation about the quarterly risk report. Instead, Elias Hawthorne tapped a finger on the mahogany desk, his gaze distant. The Miller transfer. Confirm the furnishings were included, especially the library. His voice was deep, gravelly, betraying no emotion. Chen, momentarily confused by the domestic detail, confirmed that everything remained as it was when the Hawthorne family last occupied the residence 15 years prior. Elias simply nodded, dismissing him with a barely perceptible flick of the wrist. The power Elias wielded was overwhelming, capable of shifting national economies, yet he felt entirely hollow. 15 years. That was the last time Elias had stepped foot in the summer house. It was the location of his greatest failure, the place where his son Richard, then a promising 20-year-old Yale student, decided that the pressure of the Hawthorne legacy was too much. Richard had walked out of that house and never returned, severing all ties. Elias had tried everything, money, private investigators, pleas, but Richard had vanished into the anonymity he desperately sought. Elias had buried the pain deep beneath layers of success, but sometimes, like the scent of dust motes in the sterile air of his office, the guilt rose, sharp and metallic. He had made Richard fear the name Hawthorne more than he loved the man. Elias looked at the wall opposite his desk, which displayed a single framed photograph, not of his empire's achievements, but of a blurry snapshot of Richard, taken years ago on a park swing. He rarely allowed himself to see it, but today, after the strange encounter yesterday, the image was too clear. The transfer of the house was not a philanthropic act. It was a desperate, calculated move, rooted in the sudden, sharp memory of Richard's face, mirrored strangely in the eyes of the man Elias had met on the street, the man who had offered him half of his meager meal. Ethan Miller sat on the worn vinyl passenger seat of his 2005 Ford Windstar, the minivan that doubled as his home for the last 3 months. He watched the Brentwood mansion fade in his rearview mirror. The heavy brass keys now rested in his pocket, a searing weight against his thigh. Ethan was 35, an age where the physical weight of exhaustion had fully settled into the permanent slump of his shoulders. His uniform, a perpetually stained pale blue shirt and worn black trousers, marked him as a kitchen utility worker, the lowest rung in the sprawling service industry of Santa Monica. He was invisible, a necessary ghost who moved industrial-sized bins and scrubbed grease traps long after the high-paying patrons had left. His greatest limitation wasn't the lack of money, though that was crippling. It was the isolation. He was a single father to Leo, a bright-eyed boy who possessed an uncanny talent for recognizing the slightest tremor in Ethan's forced optimism. Leo, Currently strapped into the booster seat beside him was the fragile core of Ethan's existence. Ethan had lost his cleaning job at the corporate park a few weeks ago after reporting some inconsistencies in the inventory logs, a small act of integrity that cost him his only steady income. Since then, the minivan had been their sanctuary, Leo believing they were on a long, exciting camping trip. Ethan pulled into the parking lot of the quick-stop convenience store, the only place he felt safe leaving the minivan while he worked his new erratic gig as a delivery driver. He had precisely 1,032 left after filling the tank with just enough gas to get through the next 4 hours of shifts. The act of sharing his last decent meal, a cold turkey and provolone sandwich, with the seemingly homeless man in the park yesterday, had felt less like charity and more like solidarity. The man, Elias Hawthorne, had looked defeated, lost, despite his expensive, though wrinkled, clothes. As Ethan waited for Leo to finish drawing a superhero on a discarded napkin, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the keychain again. It felt wrong, stolen. The house, the entire absurd transaction, screamed illegality. But what truly unsettled him wasn't the gift. It was the look in Elias Hawthorne's eyes when they parted. Ethan, while working the utility shifts at the corporate cleaning company, had frequently seen men like Hawthorne, ruthless, guarded, utterly self-possessed. But yesterday Elias looked broken, haunted, and that look resonated with a deep, silent terror Ethan carried. A year ago, when he was still working at the corporate cleaning job, he'd overheard a hushed conversation late one night. It was about a discrepancy in the Hawthorne global accounts, something involving a massive transfer 15 years ago, connected to a long-vanished family member, and a clean-up operation that never quite finished. Ethan knew deep down that the house keys were connected to a debt, not a gift. A debt Elias Hawthorne was trying to pay off in the strangest, most dangerous way possible. He knew something important about the Hawthorne family that went beyond charity, and the very nature of this secret was what put him and Leo at risk. Before we dive deeper into the mystery, let me know, where are you following this story from today? The sprawling network of Hawthorne Global spanned continents, but for Elias, the central nervous system was the executive floor. The air was thick with the scent of ambition and fear. Today, that fear was directed at him, but Elias was only focused on the digital footprint of Ethan Miller. He had authorized the legal team to perform a deep background check, a standard procedure, he told Chen, for anyone receiving a substantial asset from the company. What Chen didn't know was that Elias was monitoring the data stream personally, sifting through the reports like an archaeologist looking for a lost artifact. The dossier on Ethan Miller was depressingly thin. Single parent, high school diploma, sporadic employment, recent evictions, and a surprisingly clean record, except for the minor incident at the corporate park involving the inventory logs, the same corporate park Hawthorne Global was considering acquiring. Elias paused on the photograph of Ethan, tired eyes, but an unyielding jawline. It was the same look of stubborn integrity Richard had possessed before the weight of the world crushed him. Meanwhile, Ethan was navigating the bewildering maze of the Brentwood mansion. He had driven back, compelled by a mix of fear and desperation. Leo, believing it was a massive, empty playground, was already exploring the overgrown gardens. Ethan wasn't exploring, he was looking for the trap. The house was enormous, impeccably maintained despite years of vacancy, and unnervingly quiet. Every piece of furniture, every painting, seemed to radiate a cold history. He found the library Elias had mentioned. It was vast, filled with leather-bound books and heavy silence. Ethan ran his hand along the spine of a book, catching sight of a family portrait tucked carelessly into a high shelf. A younger Elias Hawthorne, severe and powerful, next to a much softer woman and a young man, Richard. Ethan felt a cold jolt. This was the vanishment he'd overheard whispered about, the reason for the account discrepancies. Richard, the missing son. The true moment of intersection wasn't physical, it was informational. Back in the tower, Elias saw the metadata from the library security system ping. The door to the west wing, specifically the library, had been opened and closed exactly 5 minutes after Ethan's arrival. Elias didn't care about the library. He cared about the small, unmarked journal he had hidden decades ago in a false spine of a Latin textbook, a journal Richard had kept. He had assumed it lost forever. If Ethan found that journal, the connection between the charity and the corporate disaster would become terrifyingly clear. Elias reached for the phone, his carefully constructed calm dissolving into a frantic urgency. The safety of the asset was now irrelevant. The integrity of the secret was paramount. Something was about to break. Ethan spent the next 48 hours in a state of hypervigilance, not sleeping in the Grand Master bedroom, but on a worn sofa in the library, the only place that felt marginally less intimidating. Leo, blissfully unaware, had claimed the dusty attic as his fortress. Ethan had not found the hidden journal, but he found something far more subtle and disturbing in the mansion's main safe, discreetly tucked behind a wall panel disguised as a thermostat. It wasn't money or gold. It was a single, meticulously preserved file labeled Account 74B Legacy Transfer. The contents were legalistic, dry and confusing, but one detail screamed louder than the rest. A clause referencing a trust stipulation contingent upon the full disclosure of all 2007 financial transactions associated with Project Chimera. The date, 2007, was the same year the Hawthorne's son Richard vanished, and the same year Ethan had overheard the whispers about financial irregularities. The document made it explicitly clear that the house transfer was not a gift of goodwill, it was a leveraged maneuver. Elias Hawthorne hadn't just given him the house, he had transferred a time bomb. Ethan felt the cold knot of fear tighten in his stomach. He was a simple utility worker. He knew nothing about high finance or legacy transfers, but the mention of Project Chimera felt wrong, too specific, too cold for a family matter. He tried to search for the term on his old cracked smartphone, but found nothing publicly available. Hawthorne Global was too good at scrubbing its digital identity. He felt acutely vulnerable. He had traded the danger of poverty for the danger of power. Leo wandered into the library, holding a small, smooth, dark wooden box he had found in the attic. "Dad, look, it smells like old paper." Ethan took the box, his hands shaking slightly. It was a simple lockbox, no visible keyhole. He immediately recognized the wood grain. It was identical to the custom paneling used in Elias Hawthorne's private office that Ethan had seen briefly during his time at the corporate park. Why would Elias keep something so personal in a deserted attic? As Ethan examined the lockbox, he noticed the intricate carving on the lid. A small, almost invisible symbol, a stylized hawk with a broken wing. He'd seen that symbol before, not in the company logo, which was a clean modern H, but discreetly engraved on the back of Elias Hawthorne's massive gold signet ring the day they met in the park. Elias had casually adjusted the ring while talking. The symbol on the lockbox was the signal. It wasn't a universal company emblem. It was personal, tied to Richard, perhaps, or something deeper and more secret than the Project Chimera file. Elias had seen the risk, the poverty, and the basic goodness in Ethan, and he hadn't given him the house. He had given him a tool to either uncover the truth or take the fall for it. Ethan was now holding the physical key to Elias's 15-year-old wound. He felt the terrifying weight of understanding. He hadn't just been chosen for his poverty, but for his proximity to the truth. The conflict internal raged. Should he stay silent, take the house, and accept the dangerous wealth, or should he risk everything to understand the true cost of this sudden, undeserved inheritance? Ethan knew silence was impossible. He couldn't raise Leo in a house built on an unknown lie, especially one that smelled faintly of high-level corporate crime and paternal guilt. The small, hawk-winged lockbox felt heavy with moral obligation. He drove the beat-up minivan away from the mansion, back down the winding roads into the familiar chaos of downtown Los Angeles, with a singular, reckless purpose. He needed to confront Elias Hawthorne, not in his Brentwood fortress, but on his own turf, where the power dynamic was inescapable. He found Elias's personal driver, a stern man named George, waiting for the billionaire outside an exclusive financial district club. Ethan, wearing his stained utility shirt and carrying the lockbox, walked straight past the velvet rope and towards George. "I need to see Mr. Hawthorne, now," Ethan stated, his voice low but completely steady. George, who had orders to immediately alert Elias if the Miller situation escalated, looked Ethan up and down with contemptuous disbelief. "You don't call on Mr. Hawthorne, you're called," George sneered, stepping in front of the club's heavy oak door. Ethan didn't argue. He knew the conversation was impossible here. Instead, he pulled out his phone, snapped a quick, clear photo of the lockbox in his hand, and messaged the single high-priority email address Elias had given him for administrative property issues. The message contained only the photo and 3 words, broken wing symbol. The effect was instantaneous and violent. Inside the club, Elias Hawthorne, mid-negotiation with a Saudi oil delegate, felt his phone vibrate. He glanced at the screen and froze, the color draining from his face. The broken wing. Richard's lockbox. The one containing the journal detailing not only the initial Project Chimera accounting fraud, but Richard's explicit proof that Elias knew about the cover-up and did nothing to stop it. It was the absolute, undeniable proof of Elias's moral compromise, the thing he had worked 15 years to bury. Elias shoved his chair back, overturning a crystal glass of water. "Chen, call the office. Clear the floor. I need to be there in 10 minutes. Now!" he barked, causing a sudden, frightened silence among the world's most powerful investors. Outside, George watched as Elias bolted from the building, ignoring the delegate entirely. Elias ran directly toward the utility worker, his billionaire composure shattered. "Where is it? Where did you find it?" Elias demanded, gripping Ethan's arm hard enough to leave bruises. "The attic, Mr. Hawthorne. It's what you were really giving the house for, wasn't it?" Ethan countered, stepping back, the risk now fully realized. He had exchanged the life of a beggar for the life of a target. Elias's eyes, usually cold and calculating, were wide with a terror that was profoundly personal. The story had officially shattered the glass ceiling, and the powerful man was now desperately vulnerable. The urgency was palpable, a frantic energy that whipped Elias Hawthorne and Ethan Miller across the city back to the silent, corporate fortress. Elias didn't speak the entire ride, his jaw clenched, staring straight ahead as the armored Maybach cut through traffic. He was no longer a mogul. He was a man cornered by his own history. Ethan, sitting rigidly across from him, knew this silence was more dangerous than any threat. He had pushed the Titan past his breaking point. Upon reaching the tower, Elias dragged Ethan past the stunned security detail and into his private office, slamming the heavy soundproof door shut. Chen, the chief legal officer, stood by, looking ill, having only received a fragmented, panicked instruction. "Leave us, Chen," Elias commanded, his voice shaking slightly. Chen hesitated, glancing nervously at the lockbox Ethan still held. "Now!" Elias roared, the sound echoing off the glass walls. Chen fled, sealing the 2 men in a tense, airless chamber. Elias walked slowly toward the framed photograph of Richard, his back to Ethan. "Richard." "He knew I was weak," Elias whispered, the mask of power finally cracking. "He found out I signed off on the initial Project Chimera structure. It wasn't exactly illegal, not then, but it was designed to strip pensions to profit from ruin. When he confronted me, he realized I cared more about the balance sheet than about the people it affected. He called it moral decay." He turned back, his eyes wet. "The lockbox, it contains his journal. Not just his emotional turmoil, but the full, documented evidence that the Project Chimera shell company was set up specifically to hide the subsequent losses, the full fraud that happened after he left. If that journal surfaces, Hawthorne Global collapses, and I face criminal charges. Not for the initial corruption, but for the cover-up." Ethan felt a strange mixture of relief and nausea. The threat wasn't to him, personally, but to the entire structure of power. "You gave me the house to keep me quiet, Mr. Hawthorne. You saw me a poor man and assumed I'd trade silence for security." Elias nodded, a flicker of genuine shame crossing his face. "I assumed you were like everyone else. I assumed you would find the transfer documents, see the contingency clause, realize the house was contingent on the secret remaining buried, and simply stay silent. I needed a clean, untraceable transfer of ownership to obscure the asset before the inevitable investigation. You were a convenient scapegoat, an unlikelihood that wouldn't be questioned." But Ethan's possession of the lockbox changed everything. It proved Ethan had the leverage, not Elias. The game had flipped. Elias was now forced to confront the absolute truth. The man he met in the park was not just a beggar, he was the ghost of Elias's own conscience, holding the key to his professional annihilation and perhaps his emotional redemption. Elias looked at Ethan not with condescension but with naked, desperate plea. The urgency was now ethical. How much was Elias willing to lose to protect a secret that had already destroyed his family? Ethan placed the small, dark lockbox on Elias Hawthorne's massive desk. The weight of the impending collapse seemed to settle over the expensive wood. "I don't want your money, Mr. Hawthorne. I want the truth you cost your son. And I want the people who lost their jobs and their pensions because of Project Chimera to get justice. You can't buy my silence." Elias watched the box, mesmerized. It had been 15 years since he saw it last. He reached out and touched the broken wing carving. "Justice," he repeated, the word tasting bitter. "The men who helped me design the cover-up, the ones who executed the final fraud, they are still here, Mr. Miller. They run the day-to-day operations. If I expose this, they will ensure I am ruined before the ink is dry on the report." "Then you have to decide what's worth saving," Ethan said simply. He walked over to the wall where Richard's photograph hung. "Your son left because he couldn't live with the man you were. You gave me his house. Maybe you need to give me his truth, too." The confrontation wasn't loud, it was surgical. Elias saw the reflection of his son's moral clarity in the eyes of the utility worker. He thought of his quiet desperation in the park, the shame of being recognized but not helped by anyone who knew his name. Only Ethan, the man with nothing, had offered him half of his last meal. That simple human kindness had been the trigger for this entire catastrophic chain of events. Elias walked to a secured filing cabinet and retrieved a single heavy master key, a skeleton key that opened every physical lock in his complex, secure system. He held it out to Ethan. "You want justice, Mr. Miller? It's not in the journal. It's on my servers." Richard found the original hard drives with the unedited financial records. He hid them in the sub-level maintenance room of the corporate park before he left. Ethan's eyes widened. The corporate park, the place he had been fired from for reporting minor inventory discrepancies. "You knew I worked there," Ethan realized, his voice low. "I knew your life intersected with the debris of my past," Elias confirmed, his voice heavy with self-loathing. "I gave you the house hoping you would be too preoccupied to notice the full context. I gave you the house to protect myself. Now, I give you this key. The moment you use it, you expose the entire company, including me. But it will finally clear Richard's name. He wasn't complicit. He was the whistleblower, the one I abandoned. This key gives you the power to collapse the empire." The confrontation was over. Elias had confessed not to a crime, but to a profound moral cowardice that had haunted him for 15 years. The mentira, that he was merely a benevolent, generous billionaire, had fully collapsed. Now Ethan held the real leverage, and the power dynamic was utterly reversed. He didn't just have a house. He had the fate of Hawthorne Global in his palm. Ethan took the heavy skeleton key. He didn't hesitate. Within 72 hours, the corporate world felt the devastating seismic shock. Ethan, guided by a fierce sense of justice and armed with Elias's knowledge of the system, bypassed security at the old corporate park. He located the sub-level maintenance room and used the key to access the heavily shielded server bank. The hard drives contained Richard Hawthorne's meticulous and damning evidence of the Project Chimera shell game and the subsequent pension fraud orchestrated by Elias's immediate subordinates. Ethan, risking his life and freedom, leaked the data anonymously to a respected investigative financial journalist. The result was instantaneous. The story broke on a Monday morning. The stock price of Hawthorne Global plummeted by 70% before the market even opened. The SEC froze all company assets. The consequences were brutal. Elias Hawthorne, true to his word, became the immediate scapegoat for the market chaos. His top executives, the men responsible for executing the cover-up, were indicted. But Elias was arrested first for obstruction of justice regarding the 15-year-old financial records. His empire was dismantled overnight, liquidated to cover fines and restitution. Elias lost everything: his wealth, his position, and his freedom. Ethan watched the news coverage from the anonymous comfort of a cheap motel room. He had already signed the paperwork, returning the Brentwood mansion to the state, making it clear he wanted no part of the tainted wealth. He hadn't gained a fortune, but he had secured something far more valuable. The deepest consequence was the separation and loss. The trust stipulated that the mansion should be sold, and the proceeds directed to a foundation in Richard Hawthorne's name, dedicated to financial ethics. Ethan was left with nothing but the truth and his son. He watched as his name, briefly, flashed across the screen. The poor single father who exposed the powerful. He was hailed as a hero, but the reality was simpler. He was just a man who refused to be corrupted by an impossible opportunity. Leo, shielded from the financial disaster, sensed the shift. "Are we going back to the minivan, Dad?" he asked one afternoon. "No, Leo," Ethan replied, pulling his son close. "We're going somewhere safe now. We paid the price for the truth, and it's time to find a new beginning." The price was dear. The immediate security of the mansion was gone, replaced by the crushing uncertainty of finding work with a now famous name. But they carried no secret fear, no looming threat of being controlled by a powerful man's guilt. They had dignity, restored and shining bright. 6 months later, Ethan Miller wasn't rich, but he wasn't invisible either. He had moved with Leo to a small, 2-bedroom apartment in a quieter neighborhood of Pasadena. The notoriety surrounding the Hawthorne case had closed some doors, but surprisingly, it had opened others. The head of the foundation, established in Richard Hawthorne's name, a former colleague of Richard's who had fought against the original Project Chimera, had reached out. Impressed by Ethan's integrity and his practical understanding of corporate vulnerability, she offered him a position as a compliance consultant, focusing on ethical oversight for smaller, community-focused firms. It was an entry-level role, but it provided stability, health insurance, and dignity. Ethan sat in his modest living room, watching Leo meticulously organize his new collection of drawing pencils. He finally had enough space, enough quiet, and enough peace to simply be a father. The mansion, the speed of the events, and the fall of Elias Hawthorne felt like a distant, chaotic dream. One afternoon, a letter arrived, forwarded through the foundation. It was from Elias, written on cheap institutional paper from a minimum security facility. It contained no apology for the past, no explanation for the transfer, only 3 lines. "The truth is a heavy burden, but the lie is heavier. Thank you for making me put it down. Richard would be proud." Ethan realized the gift of the mansion had not been charity, nor a trap for silence, but the desperate act of a man trying to outsource his own required act of redemption. Elias had needed Ethan's courage to do what he couldn't do himself, sacrifice everything for moral clarity. Elias found his own, terrible kind of justice, and through it, the burden of 15 years had lifted. Ethan looked out the window at the setting sun, illuminating the quiet street. He had traded a mansion for a small apartment, but he had traded fear for peace. He had shown Leo that integrity, even when it costs everything, ultimately rebuilds the foundation of life, stronger than any inherited wealth ever could. He started the next morning, ready for his new life, his new mission, carrying not the weight of secrets, but the light of a hard-won truth. The Miller legacy was no longer defined by poverty, but by the courage to confront power. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts on Ethan's choice, and subscribe for more transformative tales like this one.